Nation's new weekly award ceremony. It's Wet Wipe of the Week. Please don't forget to send in your nominations and the results will be announced before the end of the programme. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be joined by an incisive panel today, journalist and author Michael Crick and Conservative MP Miriam Cates. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the show, and the email's changed. It's not what it was. It's mailmog@gbnews.com, so don't send it to the old address. But now it's time for a refresh of the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. The news at 8:01. In fact, some breaking news for you that's come to us in the last few minutes. The former US President Donald Trump is to go on trial in March next year. Mr. Trump appeared via video link at a hearing in New York today over charges he falsified business records to conceal money paid to silence the adult film star Stormy Daniels. He's pleaded not guilty to all criminal charges, claiming he's a victim of election interference. That news just into us. We'll get you more detail on that as it comes to us. Well, also breaking news this evening, Boris Johnson has been referred to the police by the Cabinet Office over two new claims he broke lockdown rules during the pandemic. It's alleged his ministerial diary revealed friends made visits to Chequers between June 2020 and May 2021. The Metropolitan Police have also received a report of potential breaches of the health protection regulations at Downing Street during the same period. Mr. Johnson has written to the Cabinet Office denying any rule breaking. Now, a sex offender who murdered a 7-year-old girl in 1992 was today jailed for life with a minimum sentence of 29 years to serve in prison. 55-year-old David Boyd lured little Nikki Allen to a derelict warehouse in Sunderland's East End before stabbing her. He remained at large for over 30 years until he was convicted of the murder earlier this month. Northumbria Police first prosecuted the wrong man, George Heron. He was cleared after a trial in 1993. A former Metropolitan Police officer accused of failing to properly investigate Wayne Couzens over incidents of indecent exposure has been found guilty of gross misconduct. Samantha Lee was tasked with conducting an inquiry into the incidents in 2021. Couzens had exposed himself to female members of staff at a restaurant in Kent just weeks before he killed Sarah Everard. Samantha Lee was found to be dishonest when she claimed CCTV at the restaurant had been automatically deleted. South Wales Police has today referred itself to the policing watchdog after CCTV footage emerged showing one of the force's vans following two people on an electric bike before a fatal crash in Cardiff. Two teens that were killed have been named locally as Kyrese Sullivan, who was 16, and 15-year-old Harvey Evans. Violent unrest followed in which 15 officers were injured. South Wales Police has said a number of arrests have been made and there will be more to follow. A major search for Madeleine McCann at a reservoir in Portugal has now been called off due to bad weather. Dozens of Portuguese police have today been searching the area following a tip-off. The area of interest is around 30 miles from where the 3-year-old first went missing 16 years ago. Scotland Yard officers were present with a watching brief. Sniffer dogs were seen on the reservoir's banks as the search progressed. It's understood nothing significant has been found today. That's your latest news. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and the TuneIn app. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
This programme has consistently criticised the forecasters because they've been so inaccurate, whether it's the OBR, the IMF or the OECD, for generally fallacious forecasts. But the International Monetary Fund, in the spirit of the Leader of His Majesty Opposition, has flip-flopped on its prediction that the United's economy would contract this year by 0.3% and enter a recession, replacing it with a revised forecast that our economy will grow by 0.4%. Now, in forecasting terms, a 0.7% swing is enormous. but this is part of a pattern. The IMF has consistently underforecast the UK in recent years, mainly because it hates Brexit. And this is really important. I don't think the ABR is any good at its forecasts. I don't think the Bank of England is good at its forecast. But I don't think either of them is actively malign, whereas I think the IMF is biased, is not impartial, and so dislikes the way British people have voted that it is institutionally anti-Britain in its forecast. And it's a useful reminder why we should ignore these institutions when they drone on with their doom and gloom. And we should be asking instead, are we making the most of our opportunities, not least our opportunities that come from Brexit? Now, we had a news story today about adding burdens. Nigel Wilson, one of the biggest investors in the UK, said we were adding burdens, making life more difficult for people to invest in the UK. We have a dreadful energy bill before Parliament that in a time of high energy prices could add £118 a year to annual household bills because of green levies. And we've got a whole slew of new EU-inspired, Windsor Framework-inspired food labelling regulations, which are going to come and hit our economy. What we need is for the Prime Minister to switch on his famous shredder. We need to get economic growth by deregulating, by supply-side reforms, and by doing usually the opposite of what the IMF has to say, because the IMF is biased as well as incompetent. As always, I want to know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.com. But this evening, I'm so delighted to be joined by somebody who knows more about this, who's taught me more about economics than anybody since I was learning it for A-level, the former Secretary of State for Wales, Sir John Redwood. John, the IMF has a record of getting forecasts wrong, but this matters because public policy is made on the basis of IMF and OBR forecasts.
Yes, indeed. I think we've got very bad forecasting records from IMF, Bank of England, Treasury, OBR. They all made the same mistake, I think, over the European Union. They attribute far too much significance to trade when we've got a very big domestic economy. And they attribute far too much significance to trade with the European continent and very little significance to the trade with the whole of the rest of the world, which has been growing faster, is now bigger and is in much better shape in terms of surplus or deficit than our trade with Europe. And their models are weighted. But a far bigger set of errors made by all those three forecasting bodies was, of course, to completely miss the takeoff in inflation in the West. And then they say, oh, well, it was just the Putin war. That was a dreadful war. But the same war that drove up global oil prices and gas prices, which hit America and Britain, also should have hit China and Japan, the world's second and third largest economies. But they kept on with inflation around 2% because their central banks did not make the same egregious errors that ECB, Bank of England and the Fed made, and they didn't have the same false forecasts because those three central banks in the West were always forecasting 2% inflation when I and a few others were saying to them, your policy is going to give us much higher inflation.
No, that's absolutely right. And the IMF continued saying that inflation was going to be a short-term problem until now, and now it's saying the opposite. It's now saying it's going to be a long-term problem. We're going to need higher interest rates for longer. And they may be doing the reverse of expecting inflation for longer than it will actually last and therefore making our monetary conditions unnecessarily tight.
I think they are. And of course, because those three central banks that got inflation wrong, lurched from too much money at zero interest rate to too little money at a much higher interest rate. We now got credit crunch conditions. So in the United Kingdom, it blew up the market for pension funds in the so-called LDI funds. And the Bank of England had to do a quick about turn. So instead of selling off bonds to depress the prices of these things, it had to go back to buying them for a bit to try and stabilise the market. And in the United States of America, we've had regional bank collapses, two big ones, quite serious ones. And the Fed, again, had to do a flip-flop. It, like the Bank of England, was taking too much money out, selling too many bonds. It suddenly put about $400 billion back into the markets by lending cheap money to the banks.
So it's consistently errors of monetary policy based on bad forecasts. What should they be doing instead? How should the economy try and get back to a growth platform?
Well, given that people want these so-called independent central banks, forgetting that they're owned by the state and the governors are usually appointed by the governments, then we need people who put into those central banks models that are more likely to work. And I think the most obvious change they need to make is to treat money and credit seriously. Now, there isn't a single formula that says if they print another $100 billion, then there will be so much inflation. But it's nearly always the case that big inflations are led by the creation of a lot of money and credit. And they need to at least monitor that and give us some commentary on it. And if they think they can get away with printing a lot of money because the economy is so flat, they should explain that and be monitored about it.
Because currently they're ignoring that completely, and the spike in monetary production towards the middle of the COVID period has been completely ignored.
Yeah.
And the Government Bank of England is today blaming the weather for inflation. Yeah,
it was quite extraordinary. And as I said, he's got to answer why it is that China and Japan didn't have the same inflation problem we did, because if it's a world problem, as they said with the Ukraine war, that's clearly untrue. And they need to answer in the UK why it was that the UK inflation was 5.5% before Putin invaded and drove the oil and gas prices higher. So they'd already almost 3 times target. And I think that was about the money they created and the very high price of bonds that they paid in 2021. I was actually a supporter of them creating money and making things easier in 2020 because the COVID lockdowns were so extreme. You did need to provide an offset and it wasn't going to be inflationary. But I think carrying that on throughout 2021, when we were having a pretty good recovery and lockdown was coming to an end, was a very big mistake.
But the IMF's answer for our economic problems is to be more internationalist, to try and do more with the international club. As they've got it so consistently wrong, doesn't that seem to you to be precisely the wrong thing to be doing? We need to be focusing on what is in the national interest economically, not how do we copy the European Union.
Well, indeed, and they are wanting more austerity. Now they've made the inflation mistake with the others, so they're saying that we should scrap the triple lock, and they're saying that we need tight fiscal and monetary conditions. They're telling the Bank of England to carry on selling bonds at huge losses. I think this is all very bad advice, because I think they've done enough now to bring inflation down. I think we'll see quite soon that inflation is coming down here, as it's started to do quite quickly in America and to a lesser extent in Europe. And yes, one of the things you can do when you've got an inflation problem, you expand capacity. There's too much demand, not enough supply. And instead, we've been following policies in Britain that seem designed to stop farmers growing food by giving grants to them to do something different, wilding their land, to stop people producing domestic energy because it's said to be naughty energy, so they'd rather import the naughty energy from abroad and actually create more CO2 in the process. And we are destroying capacity, which we need to get prices down.
And I mentioned in passing the dreadful energy bill, which is going to do nothing more than regulate and put up prices for consumers, which is precisely the wrong time to be doing in a cost of living crisis.
No, again, we need more capacity. We need more of our own generating capacity. Instead, they're putting in cables to import more from the continent. We need more of our own oil and gas. Instead, they're importing it in LNG form, which is much more carbon intensive and a lot dearer and a drag on the balance of payments. So yes, we need a capacity revolution, an investment revolution. And just to make it worse, the IMF says that our carbon taxes, which are already higher than anybody else's and are killing our industry, have got to go higher.
Well,
so IMF austerity means fewer industrial jobs in Britain.
Well, the lesson is don't listen to the IMF. Thank you very much, Sir John. Remember, I want to hear your thoughts. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, as net migration figures are set to break yet another record this week, has the government found a way to soften the blow? And don't forget, State of the Nation's weekly awards ceremony is imminent. Wet wipe of the week. Who could it be?
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. And Janet says, Dear Jacob, the civil servants' witch hunt against Boris continues and must be stopped. Our country and Parliament are a laughingstock in the eyes of the world. What are the Brexiteers doing about it? I think this is a really important question, and today's news shows that there are some people who will never rest until they have hounded Boris further and further. The latest stories are just another example of how those who don't like Boris, mainly because of Brexit, are always looking for something to have a go at him on. It is a supreme non-story. I can tell you that during that period, I went to Chequers. I was invited there with my children, entirely in accordance with the rules. Another senior government minister was going to come, but the Prime Minister cancelled him because you were only allowed to have one family present at the time. So what would have been a meeting with the Prime Minister, the Chief Whip and the Leader of the House of Commons just had me there because you couldn't mix families. The Prime Minister was diligent about it. I might also say that one of my children after lunch bowled out the Prime Minister and removed his middle stump, but that would be boasting. Now, another mail Mogg.
Can I just say?
No, you can't, because we're not coming to the panel yet. John says, I think Rishi keeps his shredder just for show. I very much doubt he's ever been plugged in. Well, that's a very good point. We must ask him. Perhaps there'll be a civil servant who'll leak. The record-breaking migration figures that are set to be released this Thursday are thought to be about 1 million. The Home Secretary has revealed that one major contributor to this figure are the tens of thousands of foreign students bringing their families over with them to the UK. In 2019, approximately 16,000 dependent visas were handed out, but last year it was an enormous 136,000. It seems that the numbers only ever go up. Mrs. Braverman has announced that the tightening of migration rules will stop dependents coming with students on their studies. Though universities are concerned this may discourage foreign students from studying in the UK, is it right that a well-earning family should be able to move to the UK on their child's student visa? Well, I'm joined now by the former head of Health and Labour at the Office of National Statistics, Jamie Jenkins. Jamie, thank you very much for joining me. First of all, there was a very interesting report today saying that one of the reasons the figures are so high is because they're more accurate now we've left the European Union and we have an actual count of immigration rather than the estimates that the ONS used to do of European member state nationals. Is that part of the reason for the rise?
I don't think that's going to be part of the reading, Jake. I'll just explain kind of what the ONS used to do. So they would normally be at the ports, the airports, and they would do kind of surveys, random people as they come in, and that will give you an estimate of your kind of migration numbers. And to be frank, that wasn't really fit for purpose for what we've got now. And what they've been doing for several years is looking to move to use more of the administrative data. So that's kind of data that we've got from the NHS, the Department for Work and Pensions, and HMRC, where people obviously are issuing visas to migrants to try and improve things. But you can always get a good check as to how reliable the numbers have been, Jacob, because we have a census every 10 years. And the way the ONS estimate the population is, you get the estimate at the census, then you add on the births, you take off the deaths, and then you add on what you estimate for your migration. Now, when we had the 2021 census, the population wasn't actually that far off what they estimated through the decade. So it probably does suggest that the migration figures weren't too far off. And actually the migration numbers might actually be slightly kind of undercounted over the last decade because of the way the figures came out.
Yes, so the numbers, if they do reach 1 million, are bad, but they're not necessarily as proportionately bad as people are thinking because of the undercounting. But can we be confident that the 1 million figure, if that's what it is now accurate, is done as people come in, they're properly registered, and we know it without having to use estimates, or is it still in part estimated?
Well, there will still be in some part estimations as part of this when you're using all of the kind of the administrative data, but it will be much more robust than what we've had in the past, Jacob. And I think the important thing with the 1 million that you're talking about is the ONS themselves also do population projections, and we're planning on the basis of around 230,000 a year. So 1 million is quite high on that. But the point you've raised, I think, is an important one with the kind of the students, because it was in 2018, 13,000 family members come over. As you said, 136,000 in 2022, a tenfold increase. To put that number into context, that 136,000, now, since 2018, all the Channel migrants that have come over on the boats, every single year, every single month now since they started coming over, only adds up to 92,000. So in 1 year, we've had more from the kind of people coming over with their students than all of the small boat migrants coming over overall.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. I'm now joined by my panel, journalist and author Michael Crick, and the Conservative MP, Miriam Cates. Miriam, someone has blundered, haven't they? We met David Cameron as we were coming over here this evening.
I've never met him before.
He promised that we'd get migration down to the tens of thousands, and instead we've got it up to 1 million. What have we been doing as Conservatives in the last 13 years?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And I think people voted for Brexit with the expectation that migration would come down. Obviously, Brexit has enabled us to control the European side of migration. But, you know, under our noses over the last few years, that migration from the rest of the world has gone up significantly. And I think there are a number of different types of migration, aren't there? But obviously the focus today is on these student visas. And I think everybody appreciates that universities want to be able to offer courses to some of the brightest in the world. But these numbers are just far too high, and we need to bring them down.
But what's the Education Secretary doing? 600,000 student visas being issued. That's not the best and brightest in the world. That's a mass migration scheme.
No, that's right. And it is clearly a pull factor for people from other countries, not just to come over here to study, but to bring their families. And you can understand why they might want to do that. But when we're lacking family houses for our own families, it's clearly not appropriate. And I think we need to decide, what are our universities for? Are they for essentially our own economy, our own nation, our own people, or are they an export?
Michael, is this justifiable? Is it fine? We have 1 million coming in, and if it were a bit more, it wouldn't really matter? Or is this a big political problem?
Well, I do think, as William Hague said in the Times today, we have got to get used to mass migration with global warming, civil war, tyrannical regimes, people finding it easier to travel from one continent to another. I don't think we will ever really see a return to the days of small migration. However, I think 1 million a year, if it was to carry on at that rate, is unmanageable in the short term. And simply in terms of the cost in terms of resources, the pressures on our health service, and the pressures on housing. I mean, 1 million people, you're talking about 500,000 new dwellings, if you assume they live two per dwelling on average. And what have we, I mean, at the very best, we have a target of 300,000. So that means, and what do you think it means for the person on the housing waiting list or the person whose rent's gone up? So in the long term, in the medium term, 1 million a year is unmanageable. But we may have to cope with that in the long term and prepare for it.
Mass migration because of war and famine and so on is not 600,000 students plus their dependents. That's an economic choice that it seems to me the government's made without admitting it to the voters.
Well, a part of this, of course, I mean, I've been involved in university governance on 2 university boards for the last decade, and so I'm familiar with a lot of this. And part of the problem, of course, is that universities have become increasingly dependent on income from foreign students because they can charge a much higher fee than the 9,250, which has been that figure for years and never goes up, and no government dares put it up after the rows about university fees there were years ago. And governments, I think, have got to start putting it up in line with inflation every year. Otherwise, the universities are going to go bankrupt without this reliance on foreign student income. But you say they're not the best and the brightest. Actually, a lot of them are very bright indeed, and a lot of them are brighter than some of our home students. And the fertilisation, the cross-fertilisation of ideas. And in any case, a lot of them go home. I mean, they don't, it's not 600,000 people coming here permanently.
I don't know, a lot of them stay on and work and so on.
Well, often they're doing good jobs, though.
Well, but really the question is one of democratic accountability.
Exactly.
That if we'd gone into the 2019 election saying we're going to have 1 million students and 600,000 students, 1 million coming in, that's fine. Voters could have chosen that. But we said the exact opposite. That's what really worries me. So why isn't the government getting a grip and saying we promised this, we will deliver it?
Well, I think Suella Braverman's making that case very powerfully, and obviously today is a first attempt to put some proper controls on the student visas. And I think Michael's right about the incentives for universities to attract foreign students. They're paying more money, but you know the taxpayer is losing out. The university gets more money. The taxpayer provides the school places, the accommodation, the doctors, the doctor's time. And I don't think we should accept that actually mass migration is the future. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think it's a proven strategy. And also, you know, whilst it might have been the case until recently that certain parts of the world populations are growing exponentially, that's no longer the case. Only 3% of the world's population now live in countries where birth rates aren't falling. This is a short-term strategy, and it's not one that is democratically accepted and has all sorts of problems with it.
I don't see how you're going to stop mass migration. I don't think the government has got a clue how it's going to stop mass migration. And barges in Rwanda are not the answer. Or they're only the answer in a tiny way, and the Labour Party clearly doesn't know how either.
But Rwanda and barges are dealing with the illegal migration bit. It turns out the illegal migration bit, as Charlie was saying, is trivial. That we could take all the people coming over in small boats, and that's 5% of the total that we're taking legally.
Well, legal or illegal, that is arguable as to whether it's illegal.
What people expected was an Australian-style point system where we had a lot of choice and very high, bar of who came here. We have a point system. The problem is the bar is far too low, and the salary expectation is something like 27,000, which is below the mean salary in this country. So I think the general public expect the bar to be high, that someone who comes here should be a net contributor to our GDP per capita, and that hasn't happened. And I think that's a good place to start.
But the other problem, of course, is that employers can't get enough labour. We see it all the time. You go to a hotel or a restaurant and all sorts of other walks of life. They can't get enough staff, and they are desperate for migrants as well.
For local people in hospitality has gone up, and that's a really important improvement in the standard of living for people who were born here, and is very important. However, I'm afraid we've got to move on, but we'll be coming back to my brilliant panel because we're going to be talking about the housing crisis, and we may just have found one of the culprits behind Britain's lack of building. Oh, and don't forget, the wet wipe of the week ceremony awaits. Please remember to send in your nominations.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Alan says, those coming to Britain for work or study should not be given the right to citizenship. Citizenship should be defined in law. It should be democratically determined. John says, can you answer that if we struggle to house 50,000 illegal immigrants, where on earth do we house 1 million or more? Oh, well, John, they're probably coming to live with you. Anyway, along with the NHS, the housing crisis is set to be one of the election-defining questions next year. The government has consistently failed to meet its own building targets year after year. And as we discussed before the intermission, with record levels of immigration, demand is rising and therefore prices will remain high. But the Green Quango, Natural Britain headed by Tony Juniper, has today been accused of blocking the building of over 150,000 houses owing to pollution regulations. The Quango, which is part of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, was criticised by the Home Builders Federation, which said the nutrient neutrality guidelines, deriving, wait and you won't believe this, from a European Court of Justice ruling from 2018 when we had already voted to leave, stifled the much-needed building across Britain. So could these regulations be the source of Britain's housing woes, or are they a much-needed line of defence for our rivers? Well, still with me is my esteemed panel, journalist and author Michael Crick, and the Conservative MP, Miriam Cates. Michael, I heard Mr Juniper on the wireless this morning, and when that figure was put to him, he said, I don't recognise that figure. Isn't that one of the weaseliest set of words politicians, and I've used them myself, ever used, when the figure is pretty close and they just don't want to fess up?
Yeah, and it may well be that there is a figure near that, but it's interesting that these newspapers that seem to be complaining about this are the same newspapers that are also complaining and indeed campaigning on the whole issue of pollution and sewage in our rivers and on our beaches and so on. And we We do need regulations in this country. It's the lack of regulations, for instance, that led to the Grenfell fire, the lack of regulations or the not applying regulations properly that leads to the building of houses in floodplains and people's houses being flooded. So there have to be regulations.
But actually, Grenfell was a lot of mixed regulations because you had the cladding put on to meet environmental standards so that the heat loss was lower, combined with a lack of fire safety regulations, and then this idiotic idea that the fire brigade told people to stay in their houses when a building was on fire.
Well, clarity of regulations is important, of course, and that's clearly what we need here. I mean, you know, surely you're not saying, OK, we'll have as many nitrates and phosphates in our rivers and as you like, and people can, and all the ramifications in terms of medical effects that has. Are you really saying we'll allow that? I mean, you're a Conservative.
I'm a
Surely
Conservative.
you believe in conservation as part of it.
But I also believe in
Yes.
building houses for people to live in.
Yes, exactly. And isn't the problem here? It's not that anybody's objecting to having high standards of quality in our rivers. It's the fact that the building of the houses is not the contributing factor to the pollution. It's actually farming and Victorian sewers. And so it's almost a ridiculous obstacle to put in the way of building houses because it doesn't make any difference. Yes, let's have strong, pollution regulations for our rivers, but it doesn't need to stop us from building housing, and that's why this story is quite ridiculous.
Well, it seems to me that there must be more to this story than meets the eye, and it's an obvious one for government to sort out.
Well, I think
that the
what's
various
happening
departments within government have got to come together, and the Prime Minister's got to knock heads together and say this is absurd.
I think this is the quangocracy that is left not plugged into anything. When we're in the EU, it was plugged into the bureaucracy. It got the orders coming down from Brussels. This is what it had to do. We left the EU, it was unplugged, and now it doesn't take orders from anybody. They're just free to issue edicts as they like. They're not democratically accountable. Therefore, they are able to stop things, and politicians like us can't get them going again.
Well, that's why it's important not to get rid of all the law that we inherited from Europe in a mad rush, as you would like to do.
This has come from an ECJ ruling in 2018. But I think, you're right, Jacob. The problem that we've got into is this idea that elected politicians bad, quangos and officials good. Well, that's ridiculous. Elected politicians can be got rid of every 5 years. What better motivation is there to do the right thing?
And also, Juniper was on speaking like a second-rate politician, that he wasn't speaking like a high-minded regulator. He came up with this terrible line that there are 1 million planning permissions outstanding, so it's not our fault. 1 million planning permissions is about 3.5 years of building. Of course you've got a pipeline of planning permissions. So if he's going to behave like a politician, he oughtn't to have unaccountable authority.
This is absurd. Parliament is sovereign, right? You are both members of Parliament. This building seems to be overrun with members of Parliament, all from the same party. You are able to, if you wish, and the government, if they wish, you have a large majority to do something about this. You can sack Tony Juniper if you don't like what he's doing. I suspect the issue is incredibly complicated and not as simple as it is presented in the press today, and that clearly we do need some regulation in this field. But you can't blame it on the quangos. You appointed the quangos, and you could...
Well, actually, the quangos set up when we were in the European Union, and they were required by EU law. And if we got rid of EU law, as I was proposing, then the quangos' power would be cut. But you want to defend that, so you
what I'm saying is one should be careful about abolishing all these laws overnight.
It is a fair point, of course. But the problem with quangos is, whilst on paper they sound great because they're full of experts and they're supposedly neutral, although no group is politically neutral, but they have one job. And Natural England's one job is to protect the environment. Great. But they don't have to take into consideration all the other factors that politicians do. And, for example, there's no way a politician would stand up in the House of Commons and say we're going to scrap 160,000 new homes because of this ridiculous rule about pollution that's actually got nothing to do with new homes. Quangos only have to consider one thing, and that doesn't make them good at making decisions that have
I remember that there was a man called William Waldegrave, who you will be familiar with.
I know well, Somerset neighbour.
Absolutely, and who in the 1990s was had this thing called the next steps, where large chunks of government were going to be farmed off to these independent agencies, and the central government and Parliament were going to take a hands-off approach. Now, this was under a Conservative government. Now, maybe, and of course, Conservatives, again and again and again, no doubt you'll be fighting it at the next election. We're going to get rid of quangos, but it never happens because you can't, because you know that there are certain areas of life that do have to be regulated. Now, it may well be the rules here are absurd or need tweaking in order to help house building.
Miriam's right. A politician has to think we have a housing crisis.
Yes.
We need 150, 160,000 new houses. We've got 1 million people coming in. You were saying that needs 500,000 houses.
Well, I don't
Whereas
know,
the Quango just thinks about a nitrate.
Yes.
And therefore is power without responsibility.
Well, it is the job of ministers and cabinet committees and the cabinet, of which you will remember not long ago, to coordinate all of this. Now, the problem, I get the impression now that not much is going on in government or in Parliament these days, and that's why you're able to come in on every evening and do this programme, and indeed your colleagues as well.
Well, I mean...
but the issue of the Quangos is that they are set up independently, and their independence, when challenged, leads to a disproportionate political row. I mean, look at the ABR, which has been given sort of godlike status, even though all its forecasts are always wrong.
But there are select committees that can look into this and can coordinate this. The power is there.
Come on, select committees can do it all.
You know, I would absolutely be in favour of getting rid of, you know, a lot of these Quangos. But I think, go back to my first point, which is we now have this view in politics and potentially in the public mind that elected politicians are bad and do things for bad reasons, and Quangos are good and do things for good reasons. But Quangos have become just as politicised as genuine politics. And Natural England, we're talking about this house building, but, you know, they have a very political position on land management, for example. You know, I know that from various cases in my own constituency. They're no less political than politicians, they're just less accountable. And the idea that having more Quangos is a benefit to our political system is false. And
well,
I think
the idea that
we're going to have to move on,
but abolish them many times, and you never do.
I would, like backbenchers.
Miriam's point, politicians are good people. Even left-wing politicians are very often good people. even, dare I say, members of the SNP can be good people. Thank you to my panel. Coming up next, Tate Britain has come under fire for its new drive towards diversity and inclusion. Also, the moment you've all been waiting for. Send in your nominations for Wet Wipe of the Week. We'll be announcing the winner after these messages from our sponsors.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News. We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Peter, why don't you get together with Sir John Redwood and other hard-hitting Tory MPs and get this useless government to change course? Very harsh. Michael, time and time again we hear of the Department of Energy ministers and various MPs stating that our offshore wind generation is cheap. It is, in fact, the most expensive form of generation when the cost of standby generation, subsea engineering and high maintenance plus other costs are included. Plus, 80% of existing offshore wind farms are foreign-owned, yet have been subsidised by us. Why are MPs so silent on this? That's very important. We need to know the proper costs. And we've had a couple of wet wipe nominations coming through, one for the... which you hope you'll send more in. Now, Tate Britain today has unveiled a complete rehang of its renowned British art collection for the first time in 10 years. In the name of it had to be diversity and inclusion, some of the most popular paintings, including John William Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott, have been replaced with contemporary pieces illustrating colonialism, not unfortunately its many virtues, natural disasters and politics. The rehanging comes after years of racism accusations against artists at the 126-year-old museum, including Stanley Spencer, who was accused of portraying racial stereotypes for his 1920s Resurrection Cookham. In a statement, the director of Tate Britain, Alex Farquharson, said Tate Britain now tells a more expansive story of British art in ways that resonate with us today. We want to show that art isn't made in a vacuum. It's made by real people living in the real world. By exploring the connections between artists and the times they live in, we can shed new light on Britain's greatest artworks and showcase, that's an awful word, a wider range of perspectives and ideas. Well, I'm now joined by Michael Mosbacher, a Telegraph and Spectator contributor. Michael, is this a reasonable thing to do, because you need rehangs from time to time and some pictures go into storage inevitably, or is this a sort of effort to undermine British history and put forward less good paintings in the name of wokery?
Yeah, there's two parts to it. Clearly, there's a limited amount of wall space, so they do need to rehang pictures from time to time. But it's not just the rehang, it's not just the pictures, it's also the captions which go with them. So every picture which they can conceivably associate with slavery in any way or racism gets impugned, and there'll be a label on there saying this was racist, that was it's associated with colonialism, that person who commissioned this portrait owned slaves. So the whole, it becomes like almost like walking through a rather biased history lesson rather than having the experience of art. The captions seem much more obsessed, not with the quality of the picture, but with the political message.
So it's not explaining who the artist was, why the artist was painting, the details of the subject. It's saying this artist once met a slave owner in a dark alley and received a shilling from him and therefore is a bad person.
Precisely, an awful lot of that. You already saw it in the Hogarth exhibition the other year, where they sort of, there's one picture of Hogarth who's painted on a mahogany chair, and the caption is all about does the mahogany chair represent exploitation and slavery? Or another example in that exhibition, which is still on view, Hogarth painted the famous painting where he painted his household servants. That's one of the first sort of pictures of portraits of working class people painted in London. But instead of saying that this is a good thing, their caption sort of says, was Hogarth exploiting these people by painting them as a sort of shop window for his richer clients? So they find a sort of negative line to put on everything.
And there's this apologetic nature towards our history, of which we should in fact be immensely proud, not just in the quality of our art, but that in the 18th and 19th century we're becoming increasingly rich, increasingly successful, and we're helping to make the world a more civilised place.
Precisely. And the painting you mentioned in your introduction, Stanley Spencer's Resurrection Cookham, it's got a wide sort of racial mix of people, and the purpose of the painting was to explain the universality of the Christian message. But instead, the Tate's caption about it says the white people in the picture are painted villagers in Cookham, in 1920s Cookham. But the black faces are taken from out of the National Geographic. And doesn't this show racial stereotyping? In fact, it just shows there weren't an awful lot of black residents in Cookham in the 1920s.
And he couldn't travel easily to do it.
Exactly.
And so people hugely overinterpret, and they try and see motivations in our forebears that they couldn't possibly have, and expect them to have attitudes of the woke lefty type that actually lots of people in England still don't have.
Precisely. And even in the Tate, the change has been quite quick. There was the restaurant in the Tate Gallery with walls painted by Rex Whistler. In 2013, the Tate, as part of their restoration of the gallery, spent huge amounts on restoring this mural. Then after lockdown, it's been closed down because of its alleged racism.
But aren't I right in thinking that the Tate Gallery is Tate after Tate and Lyle, the sugar manufacturers?
Correct. Yeah.
Isn't sugar perhaps the most slave-linked commodity other than cotton? Shouldn't the Tate Gallery be apologising for itself and sending all its pictures to other countries in reparations if this is what it really believes?
Exactly. I think the Tate's got slightly lucky that I think Mr Tate set up Tate and Lyle slightly post 1807. So it was set up after the end of the slave trade.
After the end of the slave trade, but not slavery in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Which continued, and all the sugar estates must have had slave origins. I very much doubt he started new ones after 1837 with a paid labour force.
No,
it's almost impossible for sugar not to have slave links.
Exactly. No, you're correct there. It is ironic that they make such a big deal of trying to contextualise everything, but much less of
apologising for themselves.
Less apologising for themselves. But they seem deeply apologetic about their collection. It's very odd. Yeah, I mean, you have some of Britain's greatest arts, clearly the greatest collection of British art, the Tate Britain, and you keep apologising for it. You keep sort of saying this artist was racist, that artist was stereotyped, this commissioner was a slave owner.
But what is the point of a museum if it's not proud of its collection? Surely if it's got things that it wishes to hide away, it can't really be bothered with, it's embarrassed about, you should either give them to another museum or sell them.
Correct. I mean, it does seem very odd. It seemed a very odd approach to this. It's also shown in there, they've stopped them now, but they had these sort of Christmas decorations at the front overlooking the Thames. And these are all officially sort of Christmas decorations, but they're all political. So the first one of them was basically incredibly gaudy sort of lights you might expect in some suburban cul-de-sac. And they claim to be praising this, but they're clearly taking the proverbial. Then they had another one, which was in 2020, which was about global warming. Right. And instead, so the front of Tate's was covered in what looked like soggy loo paper. And the logic being the Thames could flood. And well, this is what would happen.
It is all awful woke nonsense. But thank you, Michael. And now, ladies and gentlemen, roll of drums, the moment you've all been waiting for. State of the Nation's new award ceremony, Wet Wipe of the Week. Well, we've had all sorts of nominations today, but as you may have guessed, the winner is not going to be one of the nominations that includes people like the Prime Minister, who is a great man, or even the Cabinet Office. The Wet Wipe of the Week is our first story. So congratulations to the International Monetary Fund for your commitment to inaccurate, biased and anti-Brexit forecasts. This has earned you State of the Nation's first ever Wet Wipe of the Week. And I'm not allowed to show you the brand, but I am allowed to show you a good, honest wet wipe to wipe out the IMF's terrible forecasts. Mr. Wootton, you won't have any wet wipes on your show tonight, will you?
No, but there's lots of wet wipes in the civil service, aren't they? Trying to bring down not just the Home Secretary, but as you mentioned earlier in the show, the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I was fascinated by your little story about Chequers, which is making lots of news already, Jacob.
Yeah, my experience of Boris was he always behaved well, and that the allegations against him so far have all been trivial, and Cakegate with the Metropolitan Police ended up making the police look foolish.
Yeah, and is it true that you've seen Mr David Cameron recently?
Yeah, we bumped into him, actually, as I was leaving. I was bringing John Redwood and Miriam Cates over for the programme. We shared a taxi from the House of Commons, and as we were going out, we bumped into David Cameron, who I always thought was a really rather good Prime Minister. I'm rather pro David Cameron, and not least he gave us the referendum, which helped us escape from the clutches of Europe.
He hasn't been on GB News yet, Jacob, so I think you're going to have to make a big pitch for the first interview, because that I would like to see.
Well, you get all the exclusive. I wouldn't like to tread on your turf.
But no, look, we're going to be talking a lot about this Westminster witch hunt against both Suella Braverman and Boris Johnson tonight. Plus, Mark Williams-Thomas, he has a really fascinating take on this Maddie search. He thinks that the German authorities have made a big mistake and this is providing false hope to the McCanns. So he's live, along with Tom Bauer and Megyn Kelly too.
Well, that'll be a great programme. It'll be very well worth listening to. Thank you very much. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this has been State of the Nation. But now you want to know that the sun will be shining in Somerset.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So as we go through tonight, it remains pretty settled, though we will start to see some rain in the far northwest. And this is due to some weather fronts that are pushing around the north of this high pressure that is bringing us this pretty settled period of weather we've had through the weekend and into the start of this week. But looking at the detail for tonight, for much of England and Wales, there will be the odd patch of cloud around, but plenty of clear spells too. So in some rural areas, temperatures could drop to around 2 to 4 degrees. Further north there across Northern Ireland and Scotland, with a bit more in the way of cloud and some outbreaks of light rain across the far northwest. Temperatures staying up in the high single figures or low double figures here. Now, this band of cloud and rain through the day across Scotland will sink southeastwards. Mostly it'll be light rain, but most noticeably there'll be quite a bit of cloud around, so the odd sunny spell here. But further south across much of England and Wales, a dry, fine and bright day with plenty of lengthy sunny spells, though it might just feel a little cool around some coasts where we've got an onshore breeze still. Now, this band of cloud will continue to make its way southwards throughout the night on Wednesday and into Thursday morning. So a bit of a cloudier night to come across eastern England and Wales, as well as some central areas too. So not too cold to start on Thursday here, but behind that across Scotland, Northern Ireland and western parts of England and Wales, with some clearer skies, temperatures will just drop a little more readily here. So into the start of Thursday, for much of the UK, there'll be plenty of clear and bright skies around. Further east, though, a little bit more in the way of cloud to start Thursday morning, but this will start to break up into the afternoon to allow for some sunny spells. And that sunshine isn't going away anytime soon as we go through the rest of the week and into the weekend, with temperatures starting to climb, especially in the south.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's